I was born in 1984, and I grew up in Central Park Heights. I lived first in a townhome on Poe Avenue, then in an apartment complex known as Lane Apartments on Cold Spring Lane, and then at 2551 West Cold Spring Lane for most of my life. Well, the 80s and 90s and early 2000s in Park Heights in Northwest Baltimore was not a rosy time. I was born and raised in the middle of the drug crisis and epidemic in Baltimore and in the United States. I had to live through all of that, had to live through the violence that came out of that in the 90s, more so than any time, but really in the 90s, had to live through what we call either over-policing or under-policing, never the right amount of community-based policing. So imagine living in that time in the 80s and 90s, 2000s, where I could just be outside playing basketball with my friends and on a church lot right behind our house that's still there today behind St. John's, that's on Pimlico Road in Cold Spring, where we would have to jump into the bushes and duck bullets. And then the next day we'll be out there playing basketball and we all be sat down on the concrete in handcuffs just because we were out there. That's the kind of Park Heights that I grew up in. But even though I grew up in the midst of all of that, I wouldn't change it for the world, right? Living next to the ranch apartment complex provided me with experiences that help me now understand what those of us who have the least experience on a day-to-day basis. But also, even in the midst of all that chaos, I had a loving family and really a loving community, a very tight-knit community that wanted all of us to be successful so that we could show the world what Park Heights truly has to offer. Yeah, I think I have so many fond memories of growing up in Park Heights, right? And then when I think about being a young child, I was blessed that my grandmother lived right around the corner from me. We lived in the 2500 block of Cold Spring Lane. She lived in the 2500 block of Loyola Northway, which is the next street over. Just being on my grandmother's porch, and I always remember one of my earliest memories is having one of those little song boxes and sitting on my grandmother's porch and looking out over towards TV Hill and seeing the TV antennas there. And then in school, right? I went to Malcolm X Primary School where we took field trips, where we went to the Native American Festival, where we went to the zoo, we went to the pool in Drew Hill Park, and being a part of Tawanda Rec Center, where I became a member of the Blazers Track Club, is actually where I first wore blue and gold. Most folks think I donned blue and gold first at Mervo, but it was in Park Heights at Tawanda Rec Center. Just being outside with my family and friends, right? The adventures that we had throughout the neighborhood, going to the different portions, right? If you grew up in Park Heights, you know you have down the bottom, which we call, which is Park Circle. Then you have about the middle where I lived at Cold Spring in Park Heights, and then you have the top up on Belvedere. And being able to have family in both allowed me the passport, so to speak, to be able to go through all of them. Going to Halal Foods and getting food from there. Being at my uncle's a mechanic shop and car wash, my family's business, and it's located in Park Heights. All of those memories, to me, the people really are the best memories. Yeah, when I think about the history of Park Heights, I always try to tell it through my generational lens and try to mix it. My family, both sides of my family, migrated to Baltimore from the rural South. My grandmother and grandfather, my mom's parents, moved from rural Virginia outside Richmond. My uncles and my aunts and my dad moved from rural North Carolina, where my grandfather's parents ran a farm. And they moved. They all ended up in Park Heights, actually. My mom and dad met at the fence at my grandmother's house on Loyola Northway, and the rest is history. What they tell me, and what my grandmother told me before her passing last year, is that they moved into a neighborhood that was tree-lined, where people left their doors open, where they would see people like Earl Monroe from the Bullets visiting to the neighborhood, where everyone was working either at Bethlehem Steel or GM like my grandfather, or Sears like my grandmother. And there were strong families, both black, white, Jewish there. But of course, I don't remember that. I remember a different Park Heights, the one that I spoke about, where we're talking about the drugs and the violence in every corner from Park Circle to Northern Parkway was a different drug shop. And today, we can see that the progress is coming back. And it's really about helping Park Heights, to me, become not just what my grandparents experienced, because we know that it was such a segregated neighborhood, a red line neighborhood even then, but helping it be the best version of Park Heights that it ever has been. Yeah, when we think about redlining in America, Baltimore is the birthplace. This building that I'm doing this interview from, City Hall, is where the first legislation was passed. And when you think about that in the context of Park Heights, you're talking about a neighborhood that black people lived in certain parts, right? We couldn't go throughout. Going above Northern Parkway when I was a young child was very, very uncommon. And there was these unwritten rules and written rules in some parts when you're talking about covenants and other things. And it's about now us breaking down that so that everyone has the opportunity, so that we can show that we are really one Park Heights, one Northwest Baltimore, one of the most beautiful places in a Baltimore city, where neighborhoods, I would rival the neighborhoods in Northwest Baltimore up against any in the world, because we know how diverse we are, we know the housing stock, we know the parks, the green space, all the things that we have, but only together will we be able to achieve the true greatness of Northwest Baltimore. I think the best way and the most important way to bring everyone in Northwest Baltimore together is to force everyone in Northwest Baltimore to be uncomfortable. Meaning, putting people with people in communities, having conversations that, quite frankly, they don't want to have because they're tough conversations to have. But you're never going to grow into the best version of yourself, of a city, or a community if you're just around people that you're comfortable with, if you're only talking about things that you're comfortable with talking about, and doing things that you're comfortable with doing. Making us all talk about the history of our neighborhood, right? The history of what happened, how different parts of the neighborhood felt, is the only way that we're going to make Northwest Baltimore the best Northwest Baltimore that we can be. Wow. Oh, there's so many of those folks. Let me try to think. I'll give you two. I'll give you a few of them, right, that I know in personal in different ways, right? Everyone knows Mr. George Mitchell. Everyone knows that Mr. Mitchell was well respected by everybody in Park Heights, right? My childhood neighbor, Mr. Charles Hightower, had a way where he was able to talk to all of these different folks in the neighborhood. And then I would say my uncle, my dad, and my older cousins, who throughout my life have been able to foster relationships between people who I've seen them get folks who most folks are afraid of to come to agreement about not doing activities in front of people's houses. I've seen them bring kids together and get them off the street through sports. Those kind of people, when they're running businesses in that neighborhood, and those businesses are always exempt from any of the craziness that is going on in the neighborhood. And that's about a level of respect, because people see how involved and how connected they are to the community. When you grow up in Park Heights, you have to interact with people from different races, different religions, different ethnic backgrounds, right? When Northwest Baltimore, because it's so robust, right? You couldn't grow up there and not have to interact with folks who are Jewish and learn a little bit about Jewish culture. The same goes for Christians and Christianity, right? The same goes for Muslim and Muslim culture, which is why I think Northwest Baltimore is such an area of the city that allows people to grow, because you're forced to do those things, because you are going to be, these people are going to be your neighbors, you're going to go to school with them, you're going to see them in the store. If you worked at Giant on Menlo, when it was on Menlo in Ricestown back in the day, you're going to know how you have to prepare for the different seasons, the different religious holidays that are coming up. And it's something that I think we can build upon to help the neighborhood really come together. Rec centers are such an important part of Northwest Baltimore life, but really Baltimore life. And I know for me, as I talked about before, rec centers really helped save my life, right? After school in Malcolm X, I went straight to Tawanda Rec Center. And I would have the opportunity in Park Heights because we've always had multiple. So I would go to Tawanda, I'll be at J.D. Gross, I would be up at C.C. Jackson. And what it's really about now as we go through the process of We have a brand new facility at CC Jackson, one that's just really state of the art. We're going to be renovating Tawanda Rec Center and reopening in that probably a few days after I do this interview. And then we have to do the same at JD Gross. It's about building the infrastructure for our young people to thrive in this century, though, is the key. What worked for me and my generation in the 90s is not going to work for these young people today. We have to build things that are better. We have to want more for our young people. We don't have to accept that it's going to be this small, confined space. We can build big things like CC Jackson and allow those young people in all of our neighborhoods in Northwest Baltimore to have access to quality, not just facilities, but 21st century programming. It's no longer just going to be basketball or running or football like it was for me. They want to do STEM. They want to make music. They want to do technical things. They want to do dance. We have to provide all of that, and we will. Yeah. As mayor, what I would like to see for Northwest Baltimore is, for one, for us to be one Northwest Baltimore. We have to come together as people to see all of us who live, who love, who come from Northwest Baltimore really as equal, and understand that we're only going to survive but really thrive in our area if we all are working together. Two, we have to follow through and stay committed to the plans to redevelop and reimagine Northwest Baltimore. We know that starts with the Park Heights master plan and making sure that the central redevelopment area gets done alongside the great work that's going to happen at Pimlico, and making sure that when we do that we don't fall into the traps of other neighborhoods and other cities in the past, that we're using that to make sure that the folks who suffered through all the bad things get to remain, and those who have been displaced, all those young people that I grew up with who are now owning homes outside of the neighborhood, that our generation comes back, that we come back to raise our families with our new 21st century schools that we have in Northwest Baltimore, like Pimlico and Arlington, from the jobs that is going to be created there, for businesses that can come back into our neighborhoods, so that our generation can spawn the next version of what our grandparents experienced.